Go.
There we go. We're good to go.
Great.
All right, we're on slideshow mode. We're gonna get this straight, Jim.
All right, we're in business. Hey. Oh, the fine.
All righty. Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you to tonight's program with the Robert Lunz Group in conjunction with Piccolo Spoleto. I'm Pat Luck. I'm the Vice Chair and the Membership Chair of the Robert Lunz Group. And you can see we've had this beautiful slideshow going on for you. This is to give you some information on our group and also show you some of the really neat activities that we have. Now, if you would like some more information, on the back table, we have a QR code that you can scan, a sign sheet where you can sign up, or if you would like, you can go directly to the Robert Lunz Group and sign in directly from there. But now we're going to go ahead and get straight into our program. So I'm going to introduce Chris Liloia from the North Carolina Botanical Garden.
Okay, and I'm speaking to this microphone. Can you guys all hear me okay? Good. All right. Well, thank you guys. I'm so excited to be here. This is actually my first trip to Charleston, so I'm glad that we got here early enough to do a little walking around and enjoy some of the amazing things that this town has to offer. I've come here from North Carolina, from the North Carolina Botanical Garden, which is part of UNC Chapel Hill. And before I forget to talk about it, I crossed state lines with seeds. And so I brought with me these brochures. This is the North Carolina Wildflower of the Year, but it is also a native right here in coastal South Carolina. And the brochures are over there by all the other materials. And the erect snout bean is this year's choice. And I have to admit, I don't know much about this plant. The North Carolina Botanical Garden is a lot of different things. We are a garden where we do lots of native plant horticulture, but we're a conservation garden. And so in addition to horticulture, we do a lot of things like land management or research on rare plants. And we have a whole division that works on collecting seed, increasing that seed, and then making that seed available for restoration work. So that's how this came to be our Wildflower of the Year. This is one of the seeds that is part of our native plant materials program. So anyway, it's a very cute little pea. Peas are very good host plants for a bunch of different butterflies. It's good in dry, sandy soil. It's not super showy, but it is super tough and it's really charming. I am familiar with a relative of its, which is Brincosia. Oh, this is tomentosa. So Zoom chat. Anyway, it's a good plant and I encourage you to try it. Good one for dry spots. So that being said, this is going to be a horticulture talk. I talk about gardening. I know that you guys are involved in lots of big ecological issues, and this is going to be a talk about how to contribute to the solution of a big ecological issue, but not on a landscape scale, rather on a home garden scale. So, you know, the issue here would be the biodiversity crisis. My title here, I'm already out of order and I haven't even been talking for 5 minutes, but my title here, Gardening for Joy and Abundance, is definitely focused on the gardeners. I often do this talk, I'm more often than not, I'm speaking to a group of gardeners, and you don't necessarily want to hit people first thing with biodiversity, especially when the context that we hear biodiversity in is usually crisis, biodiversity crisis. And it really, you know, there are definitely some big issues out there, not the least of which is that insects are very broadly in decline across the entire world. And this is for lots of reasons, the same reasons that everything else is in decline. So, you know, development is a big one. Another big one that's very specific to insects is the use of all of the pesticides. So I will not belabor this point, but I work at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. which is a 10-acre conservation garden where we grow primarily southeastern native plants, and we do it with very minimal inputs of chemicals of any sort. So certainly not pesticides, very little herbicides. We do occasionally cut the stump when we kill some kind of nasty invasive exotic. We do use a little fertilizer in our growing operation. We grow lots of native plants and sell them to gardeners and plant them in the garden ourselves. But anyway, those factors together, a large scale place with a huge diversity of native plants and a very safe spot for the insects makes our garden be this amazing paradise of biodiversity. You know, we have all of the insects. Those insects are feeding the lizards and the frogs and the birds. And we also do work. We have a really cool year-long program that we're about to wrap up that's focused on saving the longleaf pine and the communities that longleaf pines are part of.
Thank you.
And so
You don't have, oh, there's your bags. Good job.
Hey, everyone, while I frantically log on to Zoom on my computer on college Wi-Fi that's not working, I'd just like to make this little reminder to please mute yourselves at home, or I will in just a moment when I log on to the Zoom room. So watch out, everyone. Check the bottom left of your screen. Make sure that microphone has a red X through it. And when everybody's ready, I will go ahead and pass the mic over to our guest presenter tonight, in case you missed it, Chris Liloia of the University of North Carolina Botanical Gardens at Chapel Hill. Very excited to have her come and speak with us today. I will go ahead and presume everyone has had a chance to practice some Zoom hygiene and pass the mic back over to Chris Liloia. All right, good.
I think we all need to acknowledge with a little gratitude here that it's nice that Rebecca knows what she's doing, because not all of us are so good with technology. So thank you for that. Anyway, so you can approach, conservation on lots of different scales. So the scale of, encouraging landowners to grow longleaf pine on their land or manage their longleaf pine appropriately. A 10-acre garden where you are growing all kinds of native plants, or your own front yard or a pot on your deck. There are lots of different ways to go ahead and make a difference. So that's what this talk is going to be about. So joy and abundance being a stand-in for biodiversity. So growing all the different plants and creating all of the different habitats that support insects, pollinators, other critters, brings me joy, and then the joy that I get when I see all these plants. And I'll go ahead and have a Spoleto reference here. I know at least a few of us were listening to Watch House last night, and they told a story. They did an intro to a song, and the intro was about watching a cardinal snatch some insect out of the air and eating it, and how much joy that brought to them. So much joy that they wrote a song about it. And I think that is exactly what I'm talking about here. That's the joy and abundance. So we're growing the plants that will feed the insects so that songbird can come along and eat them. And we get to enjoy all the pieces of that puzzle. So that's a whole lot of talking before I even advance a slide. And that is assuming that I know how to advance a slide. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the plants. I'm also going to talk a little bit about I'm going to talk more about creating habitat. And I know the part that Rebecca is excited about is the stickery part. So that's where we'll finish up. So the way to support insects, one way to support insects, to support pollinators, is by providing them the nectar and pollen. So I have all the plant, even though I'm here from North Carolina, I've got a set of coastal South Carolina plants that are good providers of nectar and pollen for insects. So some of the things that I want to say about this slide is it's a diversity of colors and shapes, because different insects get nectar or pollen in different ways. You know, the long tongue bees, the short tongue bees. You've got beetles that are just scrambling around on the top of a flower and not sucking pollen or sucking nectar out of any kind of specialized structure at all. So the more diversity you have in colors and in flower shapes, the more insects you're going to provide nectar for. The time of year is relevant. So this is an Iris verna in the top left corner here. And that blooms early in the spring. Next to it is Blue Star. It's a Sandhills Blue Star, also spring. So providing nectar and pollen early in the spring is really important for the insects that are active early in the spring. So this would be bees, bumblebees, especially the specialist bees. I'll talk a little bit more about specialist bees later, but specialist bees are only in the same way that we're familiar with the story about the monarchs and the milkweed. We know a lot of different caterpillars only eat the foliage of certain plants. It's also true of a number of bees, maybe a third of native bees are specialists on the pollen of either, you know, one species or a group of species. So providing for those specialist bees is important. Providing for, you know, the different kinds of insects that are keying, or even the hummingbirds that are keying on different flower colors. And so those early season things are really important. Also the late season things, you could see some asters and some goldenrods on the bottom. So making sure that your garden has flowering plants at the beginning of the season and the end of the season, as well as the middle, is really important for providing for all of these insects. So pause again while I remember how to do this. So nectar and pollen are two of the ways that our gardens provide for insects. Another is the herbivorous insects that are eating foliage. So I referenced the monarch milkweed story. This is a passion flower vine, notable because of those beautiful purple flowers. Another common name is maypops. So the fruit, has anybody here ever eaten a maypops fruit? Okay, those of you who haven't, put it on your list of things to do. The fruit, I guess, is sort of like sized and shaped like a kiwi, but you wait until it gets yellow to eat it. So later in the season, and you eat the pulp around the seeds. And it is sweet and citrusy and really good. And you can see this box turtle likes it as much as I do. Herbivorous insects, for instance, the caterpillars that are going to turn into Gulf fritillaries, this is the plant that they need to eat so that they can, you know, get bigger and turn into that butterfly and keep the cycle going. So I will say that purple passion flower is an herbaceous vine. It comes back from the ground every year. It's not woody, but it's still pretty rambunctious. So this is not necessarily a plant for a small, carefully manicured garden, but if you have the space for it, it's spectacular and it does so much good. It's feeding the caterpillars. It's feeding anybody who's eating those fruits. It's beautiful. You can see in the slide here, the caterpillar in the top right, and then below it is the chrysalis. So getting to watch that whole process while you're enjoying this wonderful plant in your garden. So we've got nectar and pollen as important things to provide, and also the leaves for the leaf-eating insects. I'll do a little bit more of those as I go along. The third one here would be habitat. So native bunch grasses, this is hairgrass, Muhlenbergia capillaris, but any of the andropogons, native bunch grasses are really good for habitat. And bunch grasses obviously aren't the only thing that's good for habitat, but one of the things that makes them important is that they are still up and holding space in the garden in the winter. So thinking about plants, you know, it's sort of easy to get everything right in the growing season when there's so much going on and your garden is full of all the plants that are doing all the things. But thinking about what's happening at those edges. So something that's going to be a windbreak. The bunch grasses are good places for things like bumblebees to have a safe spot to make their nest beneath the shelter of the foliage. You certainly don't need to have hairgrass to have a monarch chrysalis or have a place for your anoles to hunt. but it's good for that. And just thinking about that structure and incorporating things like native grasses to fulfill some of those functions. Okay, so this is the first slide that I showed, and the reason that I start my talk with this is it's a horticulture talk, but it's also about taking inspiration from the world around you and considering not just the botanical garden the North Carolina Botanical Garden has a pretty big umbrella. Our focus is on southeastern native plants. That's a nice, a nice group of plants to include. But I also like to look a little bit closer to home. So what are the things that really would grow right where you live? And so these are plants that grow in the woods around me. They also happen to grow in the woods around the botanical garden. And this is a shot in the parking lot. It's such a beautiful picture. And it's not taken in the 10 acres of carefully tended garden. These are just the plants that happen to be growing there. I think the fact that we have a parking lot there is allowing them more sun, so that coral honeysuckle blooms in a very nice way. But you can see, two very different flower shapes. That coral honeysuckle is another good hummingbird plant. The viburnums are good for smaller pollinating insects. The honeysuckle is a vine that a lot of our native vines are a little bit tricky, like the passion flower that I started with. They could be a little bit tricky to fit into a smaller landscape because the MO of a vine is it wants to get as much sun as it can. So it's going to climb what it needs to climb to get that sun. The coral honeysuckle or native honeysuckle is one that has a much smaller scale. So this is a pretty good one for a home garden. The leaves are somewhat evergreen. It's not like you can use it as a screening plant to keep your neighbors from looking onto your porch, but it does have some nice presence in winter. It also has fleshy fruits, which are good for the birds. This viburnum, this picture is actually Viburnum rafinescianum, but the one that grows around here would be Viburnum prunifolium. So it's sort of a large shrub. Prunifolium is a large shrub, small tree. So just a really nice mid-sized landscape ornamental shrub. And it's sturdy enough to hold up the honeysuckle. And if you don't want to grow honeysuckle on it, it's a nice plant on its own. Like the honeysuckle, it has fleshy fruit, so it's another good bird plant. And just taking this inspiration from things that I see around me and then to make a beautiful garden out of it is a way that I like to approach this. So here is a picture of a coral honeysuckle growing in a pot on my neighbor's deck. So one of the things that I will talk about shortly is native plants in pots. So you don't need a 10-acre botanical garden. You can still be providing resources, supporting biodiversity in a pot on your deck. So I thought this metal ring that they had the plant trained up on was really cool. So I was looking at it and I was taking a picture. And as I get up close to it, I could see that there are some holes in those leaves. So I look closer to see what's making the holes in the leaves. And I take a picture of this caterpillar. And then I go look in my favorite caterpillar identification book, Caterpillars of Eastern North America. And I find out that it's the caterpillar that turns into one of our day-flying moths, the snowberry clearwing. So if you guys are unfamiliar with this one, it's one of the few moths that you see during the day. And it flies like a hummingbird. It hovers like a hummingbird, and it's so cute. And so this plant that I thought was the most wonderful thing because it supported birds and it supported hummingbirds, and well, it also supports this awesome moth. So, and there's the fleshy fruits there. So you can see the whole thing, and it can be very successful in a pot on your decks, which brings me to native plants in pots. So the Botanical Garden put in a new education center. It's probably 10 years now, but we built this building. We didn't have a deer fence up. We didn't have any of the beds ready. And what we did was we have to do something. So we got some pots. So we have these pots and then like, okay, what are we going to put in them? So we just go to the nursery and we pick out some plants that happen to look nice at the moment. And this is just a placeholder. It's just a temporary thing, just until we get the garden together. And so most of these things are still in pots 10 years later in the landscape. They're not things that I would have ever said, this is a good idea long-term. That azalea that you see on the top left there has been in that pot. It's got to be 10 years. I have never seen an azalea bloom like this. It is the happiest azalea that I have ever seen. It's not getting enough water. It's not getting enough sun. Its roots must be so cramped. I mean, the same thing with the sumac. It's just amazing what plants will do in pots. So don't feel confined. I mean, you can feel confined, but you will be shocked at what you can do in a pot. There are things like the Carolina lily that I have been very unsuccessful with in the ground. It's fussy. It doesn't like competition. I think it probably really wants that sharp drainage that it gets in a pot, and they're amazing in pots. And they've been in those pots for a really long time, bloom consistently, look beautiful. Things like the pitcher plants. Pitcher plants don't grow in Piedmont soil. So if you want to grow them, you've got to do it in a container. So you put your peat and your sand in the pot and you have an amazing display of pitcher plants. And one of the things that I really like about this picture is pitcher plants don't grow with columbine or bactesia. And so you get this very fun like combination that is a little bit off and also super awesome. So you can do a lot of things in pots with natives. I have really enjoyed being in Charleston. I love these live oaks. I love seeing the sable palmettos. You guys need more ornamentals that are not crepe myrtles. There are a lot of crepe myrtles here. And so the plants that I'm going to talk about next are a group of smaller ornamental trees. They're not as tidy as crepe myrtles, I'll admit it, but they offer a whole lot more. And so one of them is the pawpaw. So a small tree, it's got some cool tropical looking foliage. It flowers early in the spring. You can see those red flowers. Flowers before the trees leaf out, so the flowers aren't super dramatic. They're definitely not crepe myrtle flowers, but they're happening early in the season, so it's really great to see them. This time of year, they're making fruit. Again, for those of you who have never eaten a pawpaw, you have to put it on the list. It's like a cross between a mango and a banana. It's a soft green fruit. The critters will enjoy it as well. It's the larval host plant for the zebra swallowtail. So Chapel Hill right now, or at least the botanical garden, is full of zebra swallowtails. So pawpaws are a floodplain plant. You can certainly grow them in conditions that are not floodplain. They're fine in drier sites. They can tolerate full sun. But we have plenty of them around. And since it's the larval host plant, this is one of my party tricks, that when I have folks in the garden and we see the zebra swallowtail, I say, okay, look around, let's find the pawpaw. And we always find the pawpaw because the two of them really go hand in hand like that. So this is a really nice ornamental small tree that provides resources for all kinds of critters. This is the spicebush swallowtail, and a couple of the larval host plants for this are spicebush and sassafras. So spicebush also floodplain, relatively large shrub, small tree, blooms in the spring. So it's producing that nectar and pollen really early in the season for those early pollinators. Again, also before the trees leaf out. So it's brings you hope and life in the darkness. So down here, you guys have the Palamedes swallowtail, which is not a thing up where I am. And I was reading a little bit about how that also uses sassafras as a host plant. And then I read a little bit more deeply and found out that it doesn't use sassafras as a host plant. It uses Persea, but people got confused because the caterpillars look the same. That caterpillar is definitely one of the cutest caterpillars I've ever seen. So it's pretending to be a snake so it won't get eaten by the birds while it's busily munching away on that sassafras. So anyway, these are two. I think I've got more pictures of. So okay, here's a picture of the spicebush, which I mentioned was floodplain. Again, does not need to be that wet. It does fine in average soils. Probably wouldn't do great in super dry soils, but it also can take a lot more sun than you would necessarily expect it to get in its natural environment. And then the sassafras is a little bit taller than the spicebush. The spicebush also has fleshy fruits in the fall. So it's got ornamental yellow fall color followed by these beautiful red fruits. So another good bird plant. And the sassafras, also fleshy fruits, amazing fall color, the best fall color of anything that I could think of. Both of these are plants that would sucker if you would allow them to. You can also train them into single stems. So depending on, how your landscape works and what you can squeeze in there, you can make either of them work both ways. So you've got there's 3 more ornamental trees to add to the list. This is black highbush blueberry, Vaccinium fuscatum. So similar to the blueberries that we eat, the fruits are black, as you might guess from the name. The picture without leaves is the way it looks in the late winter. So it's really ornamental when it's in bud. It has the most amazing fall color. This maybe gets to about 5 feet tall. Does well in drier as well as medium wet, probably not super wet, but has a real tolerance of a range of growing conditions. The blueberries and the ericaceous shrubs broadly are, I think, very underappreciated landscape plants. So again, I'm going to say fleshy fruits, but the birds will eat those fruits. You can eat those fruits. The real reason that I'm pushing this plant is because of those specialist bees that I mentioned. So I guess my next slide has some references. There's actually a really nice website that is mid-Atlantic based. So it will help you to find the plants that are most important to specialist bees, but not this far south. There are cool lists in this article, the pollen specialist bees of the eastern United States, but these folks work in further north, and I could not find anyone who's doing this down here. Maybe if somebody in this room has some good ideas, we can get to that when we get to the questions part. But the vacciniums are really important to specialist bees. There are a lot of very tight partnerships. Spring beauty is a pretty common spring wildflower up where I am. And spring beauty has its own specialist bee, as does trout lily, another early spring plant. And so these bees emerge the same time that those flowers open. It's their only source of pollen. They have these very tight relationships, and providing for the specialist bees will also provide for any other insects that are active at that time. So just keeping in mind the critters that need more, that have more specific requirements and more fragile relationships will also support the generalists that can get by on just about anything. So educating yourself about those special relationships. Another really neat resource is this National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder. You can give them your, tell them where you live, and you can do it either from the perspective of the plant or the perspective of the insect. But that highbush blueberry, the black, oh, I'm not even talking into the microphone. Can y'all can hear me okay? Stand here? Okay, I'm sorry about that. I can't see the folks on this side of the room because I'm hiding behind the screen. So I'm sorry, I'm just gonna hide now. Sorry about that. Anyway, let's see, where am I? Oh, right, so this or vaccinium more broadly is supporting, according to the National Wildlife Federation's Plant Finder, 237 species of butterflies and moths as a host plant. I can't remember if I fixed this for Charleston. This might be at my house, but you can find out yourself, and you can get this information on lots of different taxa. So you can just use that as a guide to help you make your decisions. So this is, I'm conflating two things here, but it's really important to the specialist bees. It's also important to a lot of the herbivores as well that are sort of mostly by definition more specialist. So really good plants for both of those reasons. The reference that should be below that I didn't quite get to is Douglas Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home. I bet a lot of you guys know about this, but if you don't, Douglas Talamy is an entomologist at, I think, is it Delaware, University of Delaware. And he does a lot of work on how native plants support native insects and how, you know, if you don't have a certain percentage of native plants in your yard, the songbirds are not catching enough insects to raise their young. So he has done a lot of really interesting and important work. And he also puts out a lot of lists sort of guiding you in the direction of the keystone species that are going to be most important to supporting wildlife in your yard. And so on the pollen specialist bees list, on the lepidopteran list, on the Douglas Talamy's list, the things that you see again and again are the goldenrods, different things in the Asteraceae. So I mentioned the goldenrods as being important because they're late in the season. So that would be like migrating monarchs or using that pollen late in the season, any insects that are active late in the season. This is important, but it's also, you know, they're also good host plants. This Solidago nemoralis is one that I especially like because when I was talking about how the Muhlenbergia can be good habitat, one of the nice things about the eastern gray goldenrod is that it really keeps its shape in the winter. So it's holding its presence. It's really, it's good looking. It's got very nice presence in your garden in the winter. It's also providing that habitat in the winter. It's also beautiful. It blooms in the fall. You can see it blooming with little blue stem here. So that's a nice native bunch grass. The flowers are a nice gold. The reason that it's called gray goldenrod is the foliage is kind of a blue-gray, so it's a really nice contrast. Blooms for a long time. And a couple of other good solidagos that grow around here are the licorice goldenrod and Solidago fistulosa. There are certainly goldenrods around here that are very aggressive and will take over a space. So the reason that I like to talk about goldenrods in particular is these three will not take over your whole garden. So they're good choices. You know, certainly having a Canada goldenrod go wild can be a wonderful look if you've got the room for it, but these are better for horticulture. The sunflowers that go wild up where I live are not ones that grow down here. So I can just talk about the ones that are easy. Helianthus angustifolius and Helianthus atrorubens, sunflowers broadly are ones that show up time and time again on all of those lists of the important plants to plant for biodiversity. So these are two good ones in your area. The Helianthus angustifolius likes a little bit wetter. It can get to be quite tall. This can be 5 feet tall, but very dramatic when it blooms in the fall. Helianthus atrorubens is a little bit smaller and better behaved. One of the nice things about the sunflowers, you know, they're good for lots of different pollinators. They're good host plants. The birds will come along and eat their seeds. And when we see the flocks of, what's that bird called? Goldfinches coming through in the fall and just clearing out all the seeds, that's like good enough reason to grow the plant, even the ones that are aggressive and weedy, which you guys don't need to worry about. I like to talk about this rattlesnake master, again, for that sort of winter interest piece. This is a beautiful plant. It's got really neat foliage. It looks cool when it comes up in the spring. It attracts such interesting pollinators when it blooms, all kinds of cool wasps and bees and syrphid flies. It gets to be, I don't know, 4-ish feet tall. It can be a little bit taller, but it's very architectural. And then those flowering stalks are sturdy enough that it stays up all winter long and is really good habitat, you know, protection, a place to be in the winter. So here are some of the cool pollinators that you see on this. Okay, so I'm past the plants now and I'm gonna get to the maintenance part of it. So it's not enough to just have the pretty plants, to have all the pretty plants or only the pretty plants that you can fit in your pot or whatever scale you're doing this at. You also have to think about the context and the maintenance. So I'm not going to remember the statistic right now, but a very significant portion of our native bees are ground nesting bees. So having some bare soil or just areas that are fairly well drained and not impacted will encourage more ground nesting, non-aggressive bees to take up residence. Having those structures, having trees, having grasses. The andropogons are not just good habitat. They're also beautiful ornamentals. They support a bunch of the smaller butterflies like skippers and things. And then also just leaving your leaves. So those leaves are falling from the trees, some of them with eggs or, different life stages of the various and sundry herbivorous caterpillar, moth or butterfly caterpillars coming down with them. They're also a place where they're going to hide out all winter long. Not chopping up all of your leaves, not moving all of your leaves, making sure that you are keeping some portion of that in the landscape is a really helpful thing to do. Okay, so I keep talking about winter interest. Here's my winter interest picture. This is those goldenrods, those sunflowers, those native bunch grasses, the andropogons, looking spectacular in the winter. And that's all good habitat and could be full of all kinds of different stages of insect life. You don't need to have a rattlesnake master to have a green lynx spider mama and all of her babies in your garden, but sometimes it happens and it's really fun to see the rattlesnake master seed heads being repurposed in this way. You've also got things like the goldenrod gall, the insects that overwinter inside the goldenrod galls. You've got caterpillar chrysalis is taking advantage of this vegetation. So all of this winter interest is full of all kinds of life. And so, when I first started working at the botanical garden, the conservation garden, it said it right there on our sign. We were doing conservation. The curator that I worked for liked to have the whole perennial border cut back and mulched by Thanksgiving. And all that I knew was wrong with that was that the person who ran our seed program said the asters aren't even done. The seed's not ripe yet. I can't collect the asters if you do that. But here was all of this habitat, all of these stages of insect life that we were just cutting back. We were replacing it with mulch and we were going to be ready for the next year. And honestly, it's a much easier way to take care of a garden is to do that. Or unless you can go the other extreme. If you don't do anything at all, not doing anything at all is absolutely perfect. That's the way the world works, trying to mimic the actual ecological processes that support biodiversity is the best possible way to do it. I'm gonna split the difference here with the rest of this talk, but at some point, up in Chapel Hill at least, we get enough winter weather that the winter interest starts to lay down. So at this point, I very selectively cut back things and, try and grow the things that are going to look good all winter long. But also at some point you need to start doing a little bit of fatutzin because I work in a public garden. And even though I want everyone to leave everything as natural as possible, I can't get away with it myself. So that's where this whole stickery thing comes from. So did I miss a slide? No, this is where I am. So I live in the woods myself, and I'm always dealing with fallen branches. And instead of just making a heap of sticks, I would like to arrange them artfully, and I called them my Andy Goldsworthy brush piles. If Andy Goldsworthy is a well-known environmental artist who does amazing things. He's very famous. My work looks nothing like his. He probably wouldn't even appreciate the comparison, but I draw inspiration from the beautiful things that he does and try and figure out how I can take these old perennial stems and keep them in place, still make them be, ecologically useful, and also not just be the chaos that you saw in the last slide. So my first attempt at this was to just take the perennial stems and lay them on the ground in a tidy and aesthetically pleasing way. So I would make, lovely serpentine curves with plants. I would do this in the perennial border after I stopped cutting it back like Rob told me to. And I do this now. I sort of use trees and shrubs as a way to guide my lines. And so here's all of this plant material it's laying on the ground. All of the insect stages that might be in it are there. It's decomposing in place. So all of the organic matter and nutrients are returning to the soil. It is, providing a hiding space for little critters, a cooler, wetter space for the salamanders to hide out. So this was stage one. And then I escalated. So this, it was funny. I was thinking about it to myself, like, why did I start doing this? And I think that the reason that I first built this particular one was because people like to step into the bed and take a picture with that sculpture. So I was trying to encourage people to stay on the path and just using what was around me. So this little fence here is 2 sets of uprights together, and then perennial stems laid horizontally between them. So those uprights would be places for the cavity nesting bees that like that horizontal orientation to potentially build a nest. I would use things like elderberry or cane, things that had hollow stems. And then just as I was cutting back the perennial stems that were nearby, in this space, it's a lot of green-headed coneflower. So I'm just laying these perennial stems between these paired uprights, so the seeds are still in place. And they're not in the right orientation anymore. Now they're horizontal, but they're still in the landscape, and it's beautiful. And I'm getting this extra function out of it, which is keeping people who want to take a picture with the sculpture on the right side of the fence. One thing that I will say about this is those paired uprights allow you to continue to add to this, as the season goes on, as the years go on, the material at the bottom starts to break down and you just pile on top of it. It is not the most sturdy of my constructions. Oh, here's the picture. The reason that it's not the most sturdy of my constructions, for one reason, is if you are sticking stakes in the ground, eventually over time they're going to rot and you're going to need to replace the uprights, and trying to replace 2 paired uprights and keeping all the other stuff in between them in place can be a hassle. I have also learned as I've built these fences that all kinds of things will live stake. Now, the fact that elderberry live stakes is not news. Restoration folks use a plant elderberry by putting a leafless stick in the ground all the time. But this is what it looks like when your elderberry live stakes start to grow. So this fence will stay in place a lot longer if that elderberry is actually rooted and growing, and I just prune off the branches, or sometimes I don't. This is early this spring, back when the Phacelia was blooming, and I haven't cut them back because I think they're very charming. So the live stakes can make these fences hold up a lot longer. Another part of this that I will point out is when you're building a fence, when you're deciding where to put the uprights, the thing will hold together, won't hold together at all if you're not passing each perennial stem past 3 uprights. So get your spacing. When you figure out what kind of material you're using to build the fence, space your uprights so that each piece is going to pass 3 of them, because that's what holds the whole thing together. So I went from this paired system to a woven system. So this one here is still the same thing. It's still it's still the old perennial stems as I gradually move them out of the garden, getting woven into a structure that's tidy, that, indicates care and maintenance, and that still has this ecological function. But instead of having paired uprights, these are singles, and then the perennial stems are woven back and forth between the singles. So it's 1 row and you're just passing back and forth. And these have proven to be much sturdier than the paired version. And it also just allows you to use more material, to find a home for more material. So we've got this combination of horizontal and vertical elements, with more horizontal elements, fewer vertical elements. So given the fact that most of the cavity nesting bees that are making use of the old perennial stems are using the vertical, I built frames. So this is just a frame that I've made of sticks that will hold the perennial stems in that vertical orientation. And the same thing, I've had to reinforce these with rebar over time, because when the You know, when you're just replacing a stick that's holding your wattle fence together, that's one thing. But when you've got to replace this whole frame that you've built, it gets annoying. So I've just used rebar so that when my posts rot away, I don't have to replace the whole thing. And it's this, you know, all of these versions allow you to put in fresh material every year and also not have to clear away the old material, because we've learned that, you know, some insects have much longer life cycles and will be in those stems for quite a while. So you get to do the cutting back in your garden. Again, if you don't want to do the cutting back in your garden, I very much support that. When you do the cutting back in your garden, you want to think about leaving things high enough that they're useful. But if you're going to cut it back, this is not a bad thing to do with it, and also pretty ornamental. So here's the version. This is where we really get into the fine art version. We did a garden up at the U.S. Botanic Garden right by the Capitol, and what we decided our garden was going to be would be that I wanted to do that idea of very local. So it is a Piedmont, North Carolina garden, and we grew all kinds of cool Piedmont, North Carolina plants, and we brought with us our own rusty metal junk that we got from one of my volunteers' dairy farms. And I loaded last year's perennial stems into a truck, and we drove them to the nation's capital and very carefully constructed this wattle fence, and it was very well received. The U.S. Botanic Garden said, "Will you come back and make us one of these?" And then the pandemic hit, and that was that. But anyway, you know, you can do what you like with this idea. You can be as haphazard as laying stems on the ground, or you can elevate it to fine art. One of the fun things that I like about doing this song and dance in front of people is afterwards people come up and tell me what they've done. And I have heard such interesting things, like people doing things way up in the trees, and I just love to hear it. So you can do any, you know, the world is your oyster, right? Just don't let all of that good material go to waste. Do something amazing with it. So that's perennial stems. Back to the brush piles. So I can talk about stickery for a long time. So it's the same thing as you've got these limbs and branches falling. Like this is where the insects are that, you know, all kinds of critters are eating, that the fungus is decomposing, that the slime molds are crawling around on, that the little critters are hiding underneath. So let's see, I keep looking, it's the same on my screen, and I just can't believe that I'm gonna get the orientation right. But the one on the left is a sunburst pattern. It seems like whether I do this or encourage my students or volunteers to come up with their own design, we all just make circles. I don't know why that is. I've either got my Andy Goldsworthy serpentine and everything else is a circle. So this sunburst pattern has has some scaffolding underneath it. Again, it's just fallen branches, a little triangle to get it a little bit raised off the ground. So there's a little more space for the critters. And then it's like the wattle fences. You can just add to this forever. I have one of these at my house that's surrounded by, I don't even know what to call them. They're sculptures that are sort of like columns with chicken heads. And it's like this Stonehenge chicken head circle with my stickery pile in between. And it's just, it makes me happy. And it's a really good resource. And this is my very, what's the word? My willing work study student who allowed herself to be photographed as the bird inside the bird's nest. So, you know, you've got big branches, and what do you do with the big branches? What do you do with the medium-sized branches? What do you do with the small branches? The answer is always the same. You'd be creative, but they're all different. And it's shocking to me, if you build a bird's nest, how long it will last. I guess that's how the birds make it work too. But anyway, these things can really last for as long as you want them to. And when, you know, if you walk away from it, it's just going to decompose into the ground and be good for your soil. So this is one that a student made for me. She really got into the deep meaning here, and it's the symbol for this planetary symbol for Earth, and this has been there for years, and it looks especially nice in the snow. It looks nice when there's no snow, and it really helps tell people this story to just be thoughtful about how we can, within, you know, in a tidy and creative way in our own spaces, mimic some of these really essential ecological processes that don't happen in, you know, in manicured home landscape. So I guess what I'm trying to do here is, it's not manicured, but it's intentional. It has a real feeling of intentionality so that people can tell that I mean to do this. This is not unkempt. This is, you know, I'm doing something that I think is important. This is one of the ones that one of my volunteers said, oh, let me show you what I've done with my brush pile. So this is a more traditional giant heap of sticks, but it's got the little possum door. So the possum can go in and out with a little crab tree sign over the top of it. And I love it. So that is a heck of a brush pile, and no one is going to look at that and say it's not intentional. So here's the nth degree. Dead trees are also really important habitat. That's how you're going to get to see the pileated woodpecker hang out, and all of those insects that are in there decomposing that tree are, you know, good bird food, and it's all important. So not all of us can leave a dead tree hanging out in the yard. So one of the things that we've done at the Botanical Garden is, when you're taking down a tree that needs to come down because it's hazardous, instead of taking it all the way down, leave a nice tall stump. So 4 feet of tree is still doing a lot of the things that dead tree that you weren't able to fit into your landscape is doing. Some of those things could be housing, you know, making baby wrens, or supporting a decayed brown snake. So I guess my big picture here is, whatever the scale, like whatever your tolerance for chaos versus order, just thinking about how a space that you maintain can support these processes, you know, it's not, I was going to say in a small way, but it's really not a small way, especially if, you know, if we think of ourselves as a collective, it can be huge. It's important that we're supporting biodiversity in these small spaces so that we can support biodiversity in the Francis Marion National Forest. So I think that's what I've got. And so we can do questions if Rebecca wants to moderate, and if Rebecca wants to tell us about her stickery projects, I think that would also be interesting.
All right, for those of you on Zoom, please put your question in the chat. I won't touch that again, sorry. And in the meantime, I'll point out, since Chris mentioned it, that we do have a good resource for looking at the pollinators of South Carolina. And funny little side anecdote, my friend Charlene and I had this really interesting moment where I sent her an email saying, hey, look what I found. I found this special spreadsheet of all the specialist bees that live in South Carolina and the plants that they depend on for pollen. And I went through the whole list of hundreds of them, and I deleted all the ones that didn't have South Carolina in it. And she sent me a reply that I saw the next morning that was like, Rebecca, I literally just did the same thing. And she sent me her spreadsheet, and it was even neater than mine, which, you know, so I really had to show her up. And I went ahead and made a second graph that I'll share with you here. And if you want to take a little screenshot of it or whatever, these are some of the top performers of genus of native plants that support those specialist bees here in South Carolina. So just in order from left to right, you already mentioned the sunflowers, Helianthus, next up Solidaga, Rudbeckia, which if you wanted to call me Rudbeckia, I wouldn't object. My name's Rebecca, by the way. but you can call me Rudbeckia. And then Symphyiotrichum are American asters. So those are sort of your heavy hitters for the specialist bees, just to show that we do have a resource speaking to. And I don't know, Charlene, do you recall the names of the?
So it's Jared Fowler.
Oh, okay.
The website, so it seems to do the entire eastern US, not just the mid-Atlantic. I
Okay,
think Doug
cool.
Telny's stuff is mid-Atlantic specific.
Uh-huh.
Like what he cites in his books for number of species per genus and that sort of
All right, well, this must be an updated version because it didn't used to be that way, but that's good.
Yeah, that's great. And then just to sort of share my story, it looks like we've got a few comments coming in on the chat, which is great. Is that if y'all are familiar, there's a garden downtown called the Butterfly Book Nook. And it's in the backyard of a church. And the, Reverend Dash came to us one day and said, ladies, this native plant garden, I don't know. I really thought this was gonna look like Hawaii. And meanwhile, Seely Daly and I just looked at each other and they were like, oh, full of all those invasive plants? No. And so we needed to do something to clean up the garden. And one of the things I had just had the pleasure of attending was a presentation by Chris Liloia on stickery in the garden. And so we went ahead and we took all of the giant ironweed and the giant goldenrod stalks, and we took some bamboo and not live staked bamboo, dried out bamboo, and we pounded it into the ground at different intervals, and we made just exactly these sort of wattle fences. It was really easy. It was super fun to do as a group. It looks great. It's still there. Could use some more flower stalks. This spring's early maintenance was a little more rushed on Reverend Dash's part. But it's an incredible thing. And Reverend Dash came out and he said, what is this, a rack line? And we weren't sure if that was perceived as a good or a bad thing, but we think it's beautiful. And it really is just an extra way to kind of make that maintenance fun. What could otherwise be a chore is not a chore. So here's some questions for the audience. And one that I think is really interesting is, have you ever used grapevines or any vines in your stickery? Sort of a weaving tool.
I like the question a lot. The answer is no, but I should try it. Yeah. This is like, the sort of classic, you throw this out there and then people come back with all kinds of really neat ideas. So yeah, I like it.
Great. Well, I'm dying to ask some questions myself, but we have a couple in the audience here. Nina, would you care to ask your question?
As far as mulches go, do you consider any of them to be better for supporting ground nesting bees and other things?
And for those of you in the Zoom room, the question is about mulch and what are the trade-offs between different types of mulches for ground nesting bees?
Yeah, so for ground nesting bees, having unmulched places is really is an important part of it. They're not going to, a lot of the ground nesting bees are pretty tiny to begin with, and they're not going to be able to fight their way through pretty much any of that. So on the one hand, we're saying leave the leaves because all the caterpillars and the beetles and the other things want the leaves. And on the other hand, we're saying, no, you've got to get rid of the leaves for the ground nesting bees. So like everything else, everything in moderation. When I talk about why the botanical garden is such a great place to see all of the different elements of biodiversity, it's because we have all of these different kinds of habitats. So we do have the sandy dry, we do have the ponds, and not everyone needs to have everything, but having on a broader scale, providing all, the different types of scenarios is important. And the traditional mulches, like we know the story that all that organic matter is good for, keeping the roots cooler, keeping things wetter. It's good for the plants. And this is all true as well. So, balancing all of the different things that we want to do and not getting too caught up in any particular detail. The detail of not cutting back your garden all the way, all the time is the one that I'll say get caught up in that one. But the rest of it, spread your ideas in your mulch and your bare spots around. As any,
Let me give you a story. It's sort of a horrible story, but I worked down at MUSC and every May 1st, and I can't remember either mid-September or October 1st, they go in and pull out all of the plants that are flowering. And they're sitting there with butterflies and bees on the plants as they pull them up. And then they go compost and they put in the next garden. It's just horrible. And I mentioned this to that gardener, so but well trained. And she said, oh, we've got to do it. We've got to get the new plants in so they look good in December or in June or something. They're just covered with butterflies. And I just couldn't see it. I thought I'd go in the middle of the night on April 30th. Dig them all up and take them to my house, but the police had their car and the cars parked there.
you were ready to try it and you were thwarted by the police?
Yeah.
I'll try to summarize that for Zoom, just the, places, landscapes where there's a lot of annuals and they pull the annuals out when they're in full bloom, and being huge resources in terms of nectar at the very least, and because they need to replace them. And so, the push towards perennial gardening, it's slower input, it's lower maintenance. It's not as, it's not as floriferous. So it's a little less showy and it requires a little bit more education or tolerance on the part of the public to appreciate a different aesthetic, not necessarily a lesser aesthetic, but a different one that is just better for all of us, except for maybe the folks who are selling the bedding plants.
Okay, which sort of leads to a question about, is there, without getting too stuck in the details on this, is there a good time for, when we should start pulling sticks and causing stickery? You sort of made it seem like just as you're gardening, but is there a time of year?
Yeah, it's definitely a thing that I do it as I'm gardening because I'm not committed to finishing a cutting back project ever. But if you are, if that's what you're going for, you want to wait until it's late enough in the season that the insects have emerged, the ones who are overwintering in those stems, that it's warmed up enough that they're active and no longer in there. And I think that you guys maybe got some of this recently, but when you cut things back, that you cut the stem fairly high or at a variety of heights so that those cavity nesting bees can use it. And then once you've created a home, place for those solitary cavity nesting bees to deposit their eggs, you need to leave that home there long enough for those eggs to hatch and get back out. So it's not like there's a one time. You're sort of thinking about this big picture of the way that the ecological cycle goes, and working with that and your own tolerances of how you want things to go in the garden. I think that the thing about the stickery is it's sort of it's a cheat. If you don't want to see that stuff in the landscape, it gives you a way out that's tidier, but certainly, to come back to not doing it at all is the best answer.
As a Darwinian gardener myself, I'm all about just letting the garden take care of itself. So I get that. Just some fun comments from the Zoom room chat is that a caller has a snag way in the back of their yard and that they've been inspired tonight to do something more with it. We have folks who are asking what to do with pruned fronds of palmetto, and I'll let that be a challenge to everyone listening in and in the room. I would love to see some palmetto frond stickery all around Charleston in the near future. If you've seen something done with this, I'm sure we would love to find out. But I am not seeing another question here, but I would be very curious to know from you, that with your colleagues at the Botanical Garden, if you've made inroads into more formal parts of the garden, if there's sort of some more ecological gardening things you've been able to bring to more formal garden spaces, what are some of the sort of trades of horticultural or ecological gardening that you've seen with your colleagues at the Botanical Garden?
That is an interesting question. I would say that the wattle fences are the most formal version of this. Some of my colleagues do interesting versions whereby when they're cutting stuff back rather than so they're feeling like they need to cut it back to not perpetuate this myth that native plant gardening is messy and chaotic. So that the cues to care thing, or the, having to maintain some standards, folks will cut things back, and instead of taking all of that material away, we'll break it up and put it on the ground. So it's not quite a mulch, but it's still in the landscape. It's not upright, but whoever's happening in there still has a shot. So that's another version that I've seen folks do at the garden. I think that's that. I want to have a better answer to that question, but that's what I have at the moment.
Well, that's wonderful. Any other questions from the audience, David?
So yeah, I had a pine tree leaning towards my bedroom that I had to cut. And I did exactly what you said, is I cut it, just the leaning part, and so that anything that fell, if it did eventually fall, it didn't hit my bedroom or any of the house. And so now the Virginia creeper and the crossvine is now covering it. I was wondering, it seems to be not as favored by the neighborhood pileated woodpecker. Should I pull the vines off and leave it bare, or is it 6 or 1/2 dozen difference? The benefit of, I mean, part of my concern is that, the creeper just pops up everywhere. Am I creating a creeper seed dispersal system by having the creeper stay up there in the crossvine, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I don't know if any of them are great ones. The having a place for I know creeper is a pain. In my situation, it's a pain when it's on the ground, and when it climbs up a thing, that's when I'm like, oh, good, it's doing what it's supposed to do, and now I'm happy. I'm less annoyed by it. So having a thing that I was happy to let it climb that wasn't causing trouble would make me happy. I would say maybe the same thing with the crossvine. Having a place for those things to bloom without causing trouble. They're both, the creeper is a really great bird plant, maybe second only to everybody's favorite vine, poison ivy. But the creeper is also wonderful. I feel like the decomposition that's happening in that stump isn't being negatively impacted by those vines, but I could see that it might make it harder for the birds to get to those insects. So that's also interesting. I guess after all the dithering, my answer would be the right answer is the one that works for you. And
Less work.
yeah, less work. Or, if you want to make a study of watching to see what happens with that stump, you could take the vines off it so you could watch it. Or maybe something even cooler than those vines will come up. But yeah, I think what's happening isn't bad. Something else could also be good, but.
You might lose the pileated woodpecker, but you might need some painted buntings.
Oh.
Not yet.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm waiting.
How do you handle non-native invasives in your space that you're trying to make friendly for the natives? The aggressive non-natives. First, we have to figure out what they are when we just think we don't know. What's the solution beyond manually pulling them up?
I think that's the solution. I think so the question was about the invasive exotics and what else might a person do? You know, you can cut and paint the stem with a solution of herbicide. You can hire a neighborhood youngster or, I think the identifying them when they're young just comes with experience. If you are committed to doing it, it won't take very long to start recognizing. If you're killing the big ones, it won't take very long to start recognizing when they're younger. But I mean, honestly, well, part of the reason they're a problem is because the birds spread them, our beloved birds. But you know, part of the problem that they're a problem is because they're very successful at what they do. And so the only recourse that I know of is to fight a little harder. Are we out of time?
We'll do one more question from Charlene in the front.
So just wondering about opportunities to visit the garden that you're working in. Is it open to the public all the time at certain times?
Yeah, the North Carolina Botanical Garden is, let's see, 4.5. If you drive real fast, 5.5 hours away in Chapel Hill. It is an amazing place full of amazing people doing amazing work. It is open Tuesday through Saturday from 9 to 5 and Sundays from 1 to 5. And in the nice weather, in the fall and the spring, we're open on Thursday nights until I think 7 with food trucks and bands and stuff too. And not only if you're making a trip to Chapel Hill, the Botanical Garden is amazing. We also manage a garden on campus, up on the UNC campus. We manage really neat natural areas up on campus. There's Battle Park, there's Mason Farm Biological Reserve. There's also 2 other gardens in the triangle, which are less focused on conservation and more focused on horticulture, but are also beautiful and free and open to the public at Duke University and at NC State. There's a lot going on horticulturally up in the triangle. And I left a stack of business cards over where I left the Wildflower of the Year brochure. So if you're coming up, let me know.
Isn't there one up in the mountains?
There is another, at the the North Carolina Arboretum is up in the mountains, yeah. I think UNC Charlotte does have a botanical garden. Yes, I know that some of those folks, so we've met at the Native Plant Conference in Western North Carolina at the Cullowhee Conference, and I know the Charlotte folks come, but I've never been to their garden.
Yet.
Yes.
There's a guy who wrote one of my favorite native plant books for the Southeast who recently passed away, Larry Mellichamp.
Ah, yeah.
And so he has been to Cullowhee. He was the native garden guy at UNC Charlotte. And there is a garden that I have not yet visited, but in the next couple of years I'm going to. So I think we're gonna have to just have a trip and go to Charlotte, Triangle.
One more thing about that guy before we're wrapping it up. One of the things that the North Carolina Botanical Garden is known for is our carnivorous plant collection. And Larry Mellichamp, the fellow that we're discussing, worked with the curator Rob Gardner, who's the one that would make me cut back the perennial border too early. But the 2 of them had an amazing project on hybridizing pitcher plants. And so we have a great collection of their Sarracenia hybrids, and Rob's pitcher plant collection is why our Sarracenia collection, our carnivorous plant collection, is so special. Well, thank you for having me. This was a blast.
And thank you all for coming before you all get up and move to North Carolina on me. Just point out that we have lots of cool wild places here in South Carolina that the Sierra Club is exploring all the time. And you can go to our website, search for Robert Lunz Group, the Sierra Club. We'd be happy to have you at many of our other events throughout the year. But thanks for coming tonight, and thanks again to Chris.
Right, I'm glad that worked.